go ahead and let you call on questioners if you'd like.
So now's a good time to...
I would like to check with your idea what is the most important to the Aboriginal people to keep their culture. Recent policy under Ma's government, he always relocate the Aboriginal people to so-called a safe place. And in the Morocco typhoon, you know that, you remember that. He even treated Aboriginal people as a human being. Okay, you remember that. So, to the Aboriginal people, the most important is their identity and their culture to be preserved, not to dilute, not to lose their identity in the future. So, what do you think was the best policy to preserve their culture? To me, I think you should keep it in the to respect their choice for the location and to improve that environment for that area. Not just relocate, hey, I move you to the good location and it's safe, but it's not, because they lose their culture, they lose their tradition already.
That is very important. It goes really right to the heart of many concerns of indigenous people. But it's also very interesting because the interpretation of what is culture tends to be very different from the way that the law is interpreted by the state and by the way that indigenous people understand. So an example is one of the articles in the Basic Law talks about intellectual property rights of indigenous cultural creations. They entirely interpret that as being culture, as being songs that are recorded, weavings and potteries and so forth that can be patented and copyrighted and so forth and then sold. So they're not thinking about culture as being something that is lived. They might be thinking about it as something that is preserved, but for indigenous peoples themselves, what's important is culture as lived. And that goes to, of course, the question of relocation after Typhoon Morka. In fact, just 2 weeks ago in Taipei, I was discussing on a paper in which Jiang Bing, an anthropologist from Academia Sinica, examined the cases of 2 Taiwan villages that had been relocated. And quite interestingly, one of the villages embraced quite enthusiastically their new location. And another of the villages refuses to acknowledge it as their village, and they still say the old place is their real village. And they continue to go back there to farm and to visit their graves of their ancestors. Because one of the big blind spots in this relocation is that they didn't get cemeteries or farmland, which are both very important to them. So
I'm curious about 2 interrelated issues. One is, what is the extent of intermarriage between indigenous peoples and the rest of Taiwan society? And secondly, you know, it's probably the case in Canada too, but in the U.S., you know, there's been an effort now over an extended period of time to identify and award the status and privileges of indigenous peoplehood on those who can establish even, you know, a portion of their ancestry. And so, is that the case in Taiwan? What percentage indigenous do you have to be to, you know, to count in the state's recognition of you as a member of this community?
Okay. So the first question about intermarriage, I do not have the statistics to give you a precise amount. I can only give the impression that one gets from being in the villages. And those impressions are usually confirmed by statistics later anyway. There is a very strong tendency for parents to discourage their children from marrying non-indigenous people. And so I think that the intermarriage rates are quite low, almost, I would say, approaching zero, for intermarriage with Hakka and Hokkien groups especially. There, in an earlier generation, there were mainlanders moving in without wives and marrying people. But they saw these as people coming from a foreign country, and they weren't as dangerous to them as these Hokkien and Hakka people. And so I think they were more easily integrated into the communities.
Maybe that helps to explain the political association.
Yeah, I think so too. So the intermarriage rate between indigenous and non-indigenous is, I'm sure, quite low. But visibly, there is a tendency towards greater intermarriage between tribes in different parts of the island. And so, for example, somebody from the Taiwan tribe might get married and move up to Hualien or Nantao. And I think that that was very, I think it was impossible before. So there is like a pan-indigenous identity and an acceptance that they would marry other indigenous people. Interestingly, I have seen more marriages with foreign brides than with Taiwanese or Hakka brides, Hokkien or Hakka brides. It's somehow seen as better that they would send their son to Indonesia or Vietnam to look for a wife. Yeah. I met one case of a woman from China who was quite upset when she discovered where she was going. She said, "I didn't move from Shanghai to Taiwan because I wanted to farm," which is what she ended up doing. But 10 years later, she's quite happy with her position there. So, the second question is recognition of indigenous status by individuals, which is a really big issue. There's blood quantum and so forth in North America. In Taiwan, it's basically something that happens at birth when their parents register the birth of children at the household registration offices. And if one of the parents is indigenous, then they have the right to register their child as indigenous. And in the past, it used to be that only if the father was indigenous. And then because the Amis, which are the largest group in Taiwan, are matrilineal, they insisted that that should be changed so that either the woman or the man is indigenous, and then they can register their child as indigenous. So that's how they get certain legal rights. I think it would be possible but difficult for somebody as an adult to walk into the office and change their status based on having a parent. If Taiwanese people in general could say, 4 generations ago I had a grandparent who was indigenous, then probably a very large percentage of Taiwanese people could claim that they are descendants from one of those plains tribes which have now technically gone extinct. And I think
Elizabeth Warren phenomenon.
Yeah. So there's a movement now to have the Shilaya tribe in Tainan recognized. And there's been a lot of resistance to that. I think that part of the resistance is that if they recognize the Shilaya tribe, then they're going to have to recognize tribes not just in Tainan, but in Jiahe, Taichung, Miaoli, Hsinchu, all the way up and down the west coast. And then lots of people will go and register as being members of those tribes. And then what rights will they have? And in fact, the Indigenous Peoples Council has not been very open to this, because the ones with established rights don't want to see those diluted by giving everybody the same rights. And, some people estimate that, 70 or 80% of Taiwanese have some kind of an Aboriginal ancestry. It's just too much.